Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by CSU Extension. We are so thrilled that you could join us today, and I am really excited for Karim, but I have to do the housekeeping stuff, so we'll go ahead and do that. My name is Allison O'Connor. I'm with CSU Extension in Larimer County. My co-pilots today are Cassie Anderson with Adams and Broomfield counties, and Chris Hilgert, who is our state ornamental horticulturalist. So we will be on the back side of things, hopefully maybe answering questions if we're able. If we don't know, we will toss them to Karim, who will then take the time to answer them. A couple of other notes for you for today. Just a reminder that CSU is an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. Visit the website for more information or reach out if you have any questions or concerns. This webinar is being recorded, and when it's ready, we will post it to planttalk.org/webinars. We will put that in the chat for you so you can access previous webinars, upcoming webinars, and anything that we have available to you. And coming up in April, so every second Wednesday of each month, all year round, we offer these horticulture webinars. So coming up on April 9th at noon Mountain Time, John Mergel with Douglas County will be teaching plant judo, putting your energy to good garden use. So a little bit of myths. He's also going to talk about some ways that you can be more efficient in the garden. And just like Karim, John is a delight to hear. So check out the registration, scan the QR code. We'll also put that in the chat for you, but we love having you join us. And without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce you to my colleague, Karim Gharbi. Karim is the horticulture specialist in Denver County, and he's also helping fill in Jefferson County for a colleague who's on maternity leave. Karim is an amazing entomologist and provides such interesting information. So I know today will not be any different. So without further ado, Karim, you can take it away, and thank you for being here today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Allison. Let me just share my screen here. All right, let's get into presentation mode. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Karim. I am the extension agent for Denver County and then tentatively for Jefferson County. I truly love insects. I love bugs so much. I'm always showing off my newest bug tattoo, which is, I'll show you all. It's a bee wearing a cowboy hat, and he says, "Bee ha." So without further ado, let me get into my slides. So my presentation today is called From the Ground Up. We're going to talk about the types of insect diversity you can find at different layers of the landscape. We're going to start with like cave life, work our way up through the lower soil layers into the top soil, the litter layer, and then eventually get up into the plant layer up to like the tree canopy. And you'll see how the life here is going to vary drastically at all these different layers because they all provide different conditions, different habitat, different food sources, etc. Just let me confirm, Allison, you all can hear me all good?
You are perfect.
Okay, cool. All right, so starting with cave life. I don't think that a lot of us really frequent the caves. I don't really know where there are caves in Colorado, but our basements and crawl spaces create a habitat that is very similar to cave life. Caves are often very dark and moist, and so are our basements, especially with water heaters, and that is going to attract a certain crowd of arthropods. The arthropods, and I say arthropods because not all of these critters are bugs, have a couple specific adaptations. They often have no pigment because pigment is meant to absorb solar radiation, which there is none of down there. And they don't really have eyes, or they have very reduced eyes because, again, you need the eyes to process light. There's not a ton of that down there. And they also have really elongated limbs. So if you see this picture here in the bottom left corner is of different species of ground beetles. And then, A is one that you find mostly on the surface. And then as you go further to the right, these are species that are more and more frequently found in caves. So as they get more and more adapted to cave life, they evolve. You can see less pigment, but also much longer limbs. It's kind of like a walking stick because they can't see where they are in the cave or where their potential prey is. But with these long limbs, they can kind of like feel them, and then they can maybe pounce and grab on them. It's a similar adaptation that you're seeing here in this tailless whip spider, an amblypygid. If you've seen the Harry Potter movies, this was used. Mad-Eye Moody demonstrated the three deadly curses on this critter. And so it's not an insect, it's actually a type of arachnid. And one of its pairs of legs have been modified into these super long feelers so that it can feel around in the dark for potential prey items because they are predators. And there's different levels of loving a cave. So troglodynes are organisms that you find occasionally in a cave. A troglophile is one that prefers to be in a cave, but is often found on the surface as well. And the troglobite is an organism that only occurs in a cave. It cannot live outside of a cave. Um, these adaptations, while it makes it really easy for these organisms to live in a cave, it does make them look really creepy to us. So there are some somewhat founded fears about some of these organisms, starting with house centipedes. So these are normally cave-dwelling organisms. I know they're kind of creepy because they have this, this ghoulish appearance. Lots of long limbs is not really, it's unsettling to us. Um, but they are beneficial. They are, if you find them in your homes, it's not without reason. They're there because they are eating other insects, and those other insects may be more covert and better able to hide from you. Um, so if you kill these house centipedes, okay, yes, you've gotten rid of the immediate ick factor, but they are eating your pest problem. So they're not going to go away until you address that underlying issue leading to the bugs being in your place in the first place. There's some kind of moisture intrusion, or there's some kind of cracks allowing the bugs to get into the home. So we talk about this with IPM. You need to address the underlying issues resulting in a pest problem. Killing the house centipedes is not going to get rid of the problem. They're going to keep coming until those cracks are sealed and that moisture is eliminated. Um, and again, house centipedes are not really dangerous organisms. Yes, they can bite if harassed. You kind of have to be asking for it. I've held them before without any problems. If they do bite you, you squeeze one by accident, either sitting or stepping on it bare skinned. The bite is about as bad as a bee sting. It causes some mild inflammation, but it's not going to put you in the hospital. It's only an issue if you're maybe immunocompromised or you have some kind of pre-existing condition. I think they're cute. All right, camel crickets are also, these are an insect actually that you will also find in the same habitat. The house centipedes are often eating the camel crickets. Um, so they're called spider crickets because as you can see in this picture here to the right, they have these long gangly limbs, kind of like a spider. They have no pigment in their bodies too. They have no wings, and because of that, they can't actually make any sound like most crickets. And again, these are another harmless organism. They're just feeding on decaying organic matter. So any kind of like, rotting wood or maybe rotting paper that's in that basement too, and maybe other dead insects. Another cave dweller that you also find in your basement or your crawl space are going to be silverfishes and fire brats. These are very primitive insects. You may have heard of like how alligators look the same as they do now as they did millions of years ago. It's the same for these insects. They have remained mostly unchanged for millions of years. And they can also bite like the house centipede, so be wary of them. But they are more of like a serious pest because they can eat a lot of things in the home. So they can be a stored product pest. They can feed on flowers, cereals, grains, and nuts, fruits and vegetables, dried fruits and vegetables, kind of like how Indian meal moth or some domestic beetles can be dried product pests. They can also eat fabrics, especially things that come from animals, so wool, feathers, leather, suede, cashmere. And then they can also eat a bunch of miscellaneous items, like anything made from cellulose. So they can eat sometimes paper. They especially like books, especially, if you're don't store books in the crawl space because if it gets wet, that book binding, like the spine of the book, is made of cellulose, and the silverfish will just go to town on that. They'll eat dead insects that accumulate in your basement. They can also be a pest for insect collections, which is a particular concern to me because I have a lot of dead bugs. Um, and they can also eat pet food, dog or cat food. So make sure that if you are storing those things, store them in like Ziploc bags and maybe double bag them because sometimes if these bugs are really hungry, they can chew through some of the thinner plastics. All right, we're going to leave the caves now and venture into the lower soil layers. Most of the life in soil is found in the top couple inches up here, where the plant's roots are, but there still is some life, about I'd say 6 to 12 inches down in the lower soil layers, starting with white grubs, which we are all painfully familiar with. There are many species of white grubs. They all have this kind of general C shape with this body plan of the six legs up here Um, this is the group that includes Japanese beetles. That's why I say we're painfully familiar with them. And so these insects, the beetles are adults, often feeding on foliage. The larvae are underground, feeding on plant roots. Not all of them are serious pests. It's really only the Japanese beetle, but they all look exactly the same. So they can be very hard to distinguish from each other which one is actually a problematic species. And the way to distinguish them is through we call it in science the rastro pattern. I affectionately call it the butt hair pattern. So these different species are distinguished by the pattern of hairs on the tip of the abdomen. Japanese beetles have this like V-shaped pattern. It's very subtle, very nuanced. I'm not expecting you all to like pick up every single beetle, look at the butt hairs and know what it is. Most white grubs can be managed. If you have white grubs in your lawn, feel free to do some kind of management because they're all attacking the turf. And as for specific thresholds, if you do have Japanese beetles or any kind of white grubs in general, if you have, I think it's 6 to 8 larvae per square foot of turf. That is the level of which you should start treating at least. Another really cool bug that attacks the Japanese beetle is the American pelicinid wasp. So American pelicinid wasp has a really cool Latin name, Pelicinus polyturator. It parasitizes white grubs, not just Japanese beetles, a lot of our native scarab beetle larvae as well. And it has this super long tail, which is actually not a stinger. They cannot sting you. It's purely for drilling deep into the soil to find those white grubs to lay their eggs inside of. So while this thing does attack Japanese beetle, don't rely on it as like you can't buy this anywhere. It is not going to kill all the Japanese beetle. It's just kind of incidentally attacking them along with all the other white grubs it attacks. It's just a cool bug that occurs here. I've seen it once in my life, in Cherry Creek near like Red Tail Lake. Some people have, they remember their childhood sweetheart or like a traumatic experience. I have a vivid experience or memory of seeing this insect the only time I've ever seen it in my life for the first time. I call it a lifer. It'll stick with me until I die. All right, cicadas. These insects are also found pretty deep underground. They are feeding on plant roots. So cicadas are kind of like aphids. They have piercing sucking mouthparts like a straw, and they're sucking sap from tree roots. But this damage that they're doing from drinking the tree's blood from the roots is not significant. It is not worth managing for. There is no noticeable effect on the tree's health from this feeding. And a lot of species of cicadas, not all of them, but some species emerge periodically, often in like prime number years. Like on the East Coast, some will emerge every 13 and 17 years. We don't have those species here in Colorado. We do have species of cicada that emerge every single year. Um, but I want to talk about, why the ones that do have that periodical emergence, why they do that. So cicadas, when they emerge en masse, and they don't really have any good defense mechanism. They can't bite, they can't sting, they're not particularly fast. Their main defense mechanism is just to overwhelm their predators with sheer numbers. There are just too many cicadas to eat, so some are inevitably going to survive and create the next generation. Now, why do the cicadas emerge only on prime number years? That is because a lot of other predators usually, actually, let me back up. Prime numbers are numbers that are only divisible by themselves. So 13, 7, and 17, they're not multiples of 2, 3, 4, 5. They're only divisible by 7 and 1. Okay. Most predators, though, their populations have these boom and bust cycles on more regular intervals, on the intervals of like 3 to 4 years. And so the cicadas, by emerging only in prime number years, that ensures that their population emergences, their booms, will never align with those other predators for more than a single cycle. So let's say you have a predator that emerges every like 4 years, as you're seeing here with the red line. So it's going to skip the predator's population boom is going to skip the cicada emergence one year. Maybe it'll align the next year, but it'll never align for more than for two successive cicada emergences. So they can never fully take advantage of that massive food source the cicadas are providing. And so the cicadas will always have at least one period to recover from that mass predation event. All right, now let's venture further from we're leaving the lower layers of the soil, now reaching the topsoil. And we're going to keep talking about cicadas actually, because there's a really, really interesting fungus that infects cicadas and it kind of controls their brain. If you've heard of cordyceps or you've seen The Last of Us, this genus is, I think this fungus is in the same family. I'm going to play for you a little video about what happens.
Compared to this one. Fungi in the genus Massospora, which is a dad joke time bomb, have a taste for cicadas. Now, some cicadas are around every year, but some species only come up every 13 to 17 years, all at once. And for a fungus that likes to eat them, that's a buffet worth waiting for. For those 13 to 17 years, the cicada lives underground as a nymph. Spores of the fungus can also be found in that soil. And as these cicada nymphs begin to emerge, some of them are infected. Getting right to it, the fungus eats away the cicada's abdomen and sexual organs, which apparently they can live without. Then it creates a whole bunch of conidiaspores, which form a sort of plug back there. You could say their back end is a massospora. I told you. These little conidia are specially designed to quickly infect other cicadas. Now, you might think that having a half-body riddled with fungus would be a bit of a red flag in the dating world, but the fungus has some tricks. Some species of Massospora pump the cicada full of psilocybin, which is the hallucinogenic compound in magic mushrooms. And it also creates cathinone, which is a stimulant. So the infected cicadas are the life of the party. Todd, what happened to your ass? Who cares? Woo! The fungus also does something else that's quite sneaky. It somehow manipulates infected male cicadas into changing their mating call, which normally sounds like this, to sound like a female cicada, which sounds like this. And the bottom line is that
I encourage you to check out the video in its entirety. Really cool stuff. And also Massospora, it does occur here in Colorado. I have seen it myself several times, especially in like pine and conifer. You'll just find cicadas that are missing their whole butt. All right. Also in the soil, you'll find a huge diversity of mites. That's what this picture is of here. Just all the different types of mites that are in the soil. These mites are doing a lot of different things. They are eating detritus. They're eating fungi. A lot of them eat insect eggs. So you can thank some of these mites for why certain insects aren't as much of a problem as they could be. They also help to improve soil properties. As soil, we add organic matter to it over time, these soil organisms produce a compound called glomalin. It's like a little glue that kind of glues the soil particles into these larger aggregates. And that's what you need to have a healthy soil. Aggregates, help form those larger soil particles with the more diversity of sizes. So you have more pore spaces for air and water. A lot of these mites also have a behavior of riding other insects, like a horse almost. We call it foracy. I'm going to come back to this in a second. This is the most common mite that you'll find in the soil. They're called beetle mites because kind of like how beetles have that big armored covering, these mites also have this really large carapace that protects them from being eaten by a lot of the other organisms in the soil that want to eat whatever they come across. But back to the host riding. So a lot of mites will ride on other insects to essentially to disperse themselves to farther sides because the mites, they can't fly, they don't have wings. They need to ride somewhere. Some of these mites are being parasitic. They are sucking blood from their host and getting a ride. Some are just using them as like public transit. But there's specific mites here that associate with this insect that you can barely see because it is so covered in mites, the burying beetle. So this is an insect, the burying beetle likes to eat dead animals. So whenever I'm on a walk or a hike and I see a dead squirrel, I'll poke it with a stick, turn it over, and you can often find a huge diversity of these burying beetles. So the burying beetles, they will lay their eggs and raise their family actually in that corpse. And they have to deal with flies. Flies also like to attack and lay their eggs in dead animals. And the fly larva can grow faster and get bigger and then eat the beetle larva. That's where the mites come in. So these mites are not sucking the beetle's blood. They're using it as a ride, but it actually is a mutually beneficial relationship between the mites and the beetles because when the beetle finds an appropriate nursery, a nice dead rodent, the mites will crawl off. They will then patrol the cadaver, and if they find any fly eggs, they will eat them. So they are eliminating the burying beetle's main competitor. They will occasionally eat a couple beetle eggs, but for the most part, they are helping the beetles out. All right, you will also find a ton of nematodes down here in the soil, and there's a huge diversity of these as well. They all have different mouth parts for different feeding strategies. You have the bacteriivores who are kind of like whale sharks. They've got a big open mouth. They're just kind of like filter feeding all their organic matter and filtering up bacteria. Um, and then the herbivores and the fungivores have like a bit more like a needle because they are piercing the walls of fungi and plants and then sucking out the contents. And then things like omnivores and predators have like a tooth mouth because they are really, tearing into their prey and ripping them apart. These are just illustrations here on the right of these mouth parts, but here in this picture, I can show you what these mouth parts look like under an electron microscope. So the bacterial feeders, again, big open mouth on the far left just for filter feeding. And then the predators and omnivores, you see this big hook harpoon. I would not want to be they're often eating other nematodes, and I would not want to be the other nematode on the receiving end of this thing. There are also, one of the plant parasitic nematodes, they're called root knot nematodes. These are not really that common here in Colorado, but I have seen them before. When they find a plant they want to infest, the female will she'll kind of bury her head in the root epidermis, and then her body swells up and becomes super swollen. And that eventually will cause these lesions on the roots, these big swollen nodules. These are not the same as the root nodes that you'll see in legumes. To review, some plants produce little similar looking lesions that house beneficial bacteria that will then fix nitrogen. That's not what's happening here. These are completely bad for the plant, and they will eventually kill it if left untreated. Thankfully, root knot nematodes, they can be managed with crop rotation. So just, rotating with like marigolds, maybe castor bean, any kind of plant that it's aromatic or it has toxic compounds in it, for I think a period of at least 2 years, that'll get rid of the nematodes that are in the soil because they can go dormant for, about 2 years. And there are also things that eat the nematodes too, like fungi. One specific, they all have different types of strategies for catching nematodes, but my favorite is Arthrobotrys. So this genus of fungi, they produce these three-dimensional rings that you can see here on the left. So in the bottom left corner is what the rings look like at rest. And then once a nematode swims through them, the fungal hyphae in this ring, they quickly fill with water. That causes the diameter to narrow. And so once a nematode has kind of swum through, this little ring will fill with water and then constrict around the nematode, immobilizing it. So it can't move. Once it has been immobilized, then the fungi will grow its hyphae and penetrate the nematode and digest it. So not a fun way to go, but they deserve it for eating our plants. All right, we're going to leave the topsoil, and now we're going up into the litter layer. So all the insects that you can find in this layer of organic matter, it's actually a hotspot for diversity. But for especially really small things that you probably wouldn't notice with the naked eye, starting with springtails. So these are insects that are so small, like smaller than thrips or spider mites, smaller than like the white part of your fingernail usually. There are some larger species that can be seen with the naked eye. But yeah, for the most part, very small. As you can see in this picture to the top right, that right there, this little red thing is one of those parasitic mites that is sucking blood from the springtail. And those things are really small to give you an idea of size. So springtails are eating detritus, rotting organic matter, and also fungi. They are so prized for their fungi eating ability that they are often sold commercially for use in terrariums because they will eat any mold that arises in those terrariums. And they're also very cool because they are one of the very few insects that can jump from the surface of the water. And I'm going to show you another video in a second of what that looks like. They're able to jump, they're called springtails because they have this spring-loaded tail called the furcula. So at rest, this little tail is tucked up against the abdomen. And then when they want to jump, they just, let it loose and it flings them away from predators usually. It's used to escape predation. Let me show you what that jumping looks like in slow motion.
Lots of things want to eat you, like this young water strider. Nope. Not today, kid. Hey, hold my beer! power these life-saving leaps a springtail deploys the furcula. It just pushes down this lever, and in 2 milliseconds, it's defying gravity. It vaults up to what would be a 6th floor for you and me. But what goes up must come down, and hopefully you land right side up, so you're ready to dart off again when the water strider catches up. Yeah, water striders jump too.
Okay. And these springtails, by the way, you can find them if you are like, in the leaf litter, but also large rocks or logs in contact with soil. I'll lift them up, and then these little white things will scurry for cover as soon as you do that. Those are usually the springtails. One more video on springtails. There's a really cool road beetle. This is a really short video that hunts springtails with like an extendable mouth.
This is one of the coolest insect predator-prey interactions I've ever filmed. Let me introduce you to this, a road beetle in the genus Stennis. And the thing it's about to attack is this, a tiny springtail in the genus Folsomia. Watch what it does. Stennis beetles have a projectile mouthpart that works kind of like a sticky harpoon, and they shoot it at their prey. Here, let me show you what that footage looks like again. It happens fast. This sequence you're seeing was filmed at 6,000 frames per second.
I know that the quality wasn't that great there, but yeah, it's a really interesting mouth part. The guy who actually made this video, Dr. Adrian, I think it's Hart, makes a ton of really cool insect videos, like footage that you will never find anywhere else. All right, moving on. Also in this organic matter layer, litter layer, you'll also find antlions. So antlions are the larvae of a flying insect. They are called antlions because they mainly feed on ants with a very interesting hunting strategy. They dig little pits in the sand, like an inverted anthill, and wait for things to kind of fall into them, which reminds me of the sandworms from Star Wars. So this is what those pits look like. They prefer really sandy soil, often at the base of like pine trees. I see a lot of these, at least like in the Front Range area, like in Evergreen, like Beaver Brook Trailhead has tons of them, but you can find them throughout the United States. And these are very small. There's a penny here for scale. You will often, if you're not looking for these, you are likely to overlook them. And one more video of just how they hunt is fascinating.
Its presence revealed only by catapulted corpses. The grisly remains of discarded victims. Empty shells of insects, murdered and tossed aside. But by what? By this, the antlion, the spawn of the netherworld. This is its lair. Digging backwards in the sand, the antlion creates a funnel-shaped burrow. Then, it buries itself to lie in wait for its next victim. The ants have no idea that a trap lies below. A firebug loses its grip on the sand and slips down the funnel into waiting jaws. Once he pulls his catch into the sand, the antlion injects it with poison and digestive enzymes and sucks out its liquefied guts. Then it throws the empty bug shell up, and away. If the victims don't slide down on their own, the antlion launches an assault. Struggling only makes matters worse. Finally, the assassin reaches up to make the kill, injecting its toxic cocktail. Resistance is futile.
So, fun stuff. these antlions, the larvae are very small, like, maybe as big as like the white part of your fingernail, like closer to the joint, not the part that you chew on. But yeah, you really won't see them unless you're looking for them. Even when I have come and like dug up the pits, it's very hard to find them. But the adults are much larger. They're often the size of like, small bees or robber flies. Um, and the last thing I'll say about antlions, besides this slide here, is that they are not really relevant to you as a backyard gardener. Lacewings are very closely related and are really beneficial insects. They are like the antlions, they look kind of similar, and they are predators eating small insects in the garden. And they are also commercially available. But the antlion is just a cool bug that occurs here in Colorado. Some species in the genus Myrmeleon are known as doodle bugs because as you saw in the first part of the video, they will kind of burrow backwards to find the right spot to make their pit in. Some species make these really interesting doodle-like patterns as they are finding the right soil to make that antlion pit in. All right, now let's talk about ants. I could do a whole presentation just on ants. They have a huge variety of fascinating behaviors. They're really important decomposers. They are eating whatever dead stuff accumulates on the sidewalk, on the ground. So they're preventing dead stuff from just piling up all over the place. Also, they can help to aerate the soil through their tunnels, kind of like worms. But they can be a bit of a garden or a house pest. You all know about how ants can farm aphids, making them a garden pest. Um, some are considered house pests like carpenter ants because if there's like wood that is already moisture damaged, they can exacerbate the damage and make it worse. Um, and people often ask me, this ant I found in my house, is it a carpenter ant or a regular ant, like a field ant? And the way to distinguish them, there's two ways. One is mainly through size. Carpenter ants are much larger, often about like 3/8 of an inch, whereas the field ants are going to be much smaller, often going to be like an eighth of an inch or smaller than that. The other way, which is a bit more nuanced, is the curvature of the thorax. So if you're a master gardener and you get one of these, pictures of an insect, if the thorax is evenly rounded, that's going to be carpenter ants. And then other ants like field ants have more of like a bumpy thorax. So that's how you can distinguish them from pictures if the pictures are high enough quality. They usually are not. They're very blurry. Speaking of ants, I want to dissuade you all from using most of like the spray insecticides that you'll find, like carbaryl or the organophosphates, because a lot of ants can be what we call polygynous or polydomous, meaning they have multiple queens and multiple nest sites that are all connected. And if you spray one of these polygynous colonies with an insecticide, that will often maybe kill some ants on contact, but it usually causes the colony to splinter into a bunch of smaller colonies that have their own queens already, so they are good to go already. So if you are trying to manage ants, there are some insecticides that are much more effective that are usually insecticide-laced baits that you'll feed, and then the whole colony will be poisoned. So instead of fracturing, it'll slowly kill off everybody. Like boric acid and also some of the more recently developed insecticides like the chitin synthesis inhibitors. They go under things like the trade name like Dimilin or diflubenzuron. They're also more environmentally friendly. I'm getting on a tangent now. I'll stay back. Let me get back on topic with 10 minutes left. All right, let's talk about the herbaceous layer, all the bugs that you'll find kind of in the short plants in the garden or in the landscape too. Still talking about ants and aphids. So, ants and aphids have this mutualism where the ants will basically farm the aphids. They will collect their sugary poop. So aphids are sucking plant sap and they're pooping it out. It's still very high in sugar because they just filtered out a little bit of protein. And then there are a bunch of, butt munching ants that are always at the ready, tapping the aphid's butt with their antenna to solicit that sugary nectar. In exchange, they will protect the aphids from predators and parasites. They will also move the aphids to newer plants, kind of like moving your cows to greener pastures. And some ant species can even secrete chemicals that'll inhibit the wing development in aphids. So they basically don't want their livestock to fly away. They want to keep them in one spot by stopping them from making wings. One more thing about the aphids and ants. They usually are just farming them, but some species, once the aphids stop producing honeydew, they'll eat the aphid. So they kind of turn their dairy cows into livestock once they've kind of reach the end of their lifespan. All right, also in the herbaceous layer, you will find tons and tons of spiders. And spiders in the orb weaver family, the Aranidae, have these really peculiar web decorations. They make these cool patterns out of silk in their webs, which serve a very specific purpose. They're called stabilimentum, and they are meant to make the web more visible to birds and bats, to large animals, because they don't want birds and bats to fly into their web. That'll destroy the web, and these things are too big for the spiders to eat. And these webs the silk takes a lot of energy to make, so they'd rather not waste it. So these decorations are meant like almost like big warning signals, like saying, "Hey, there's a web here. Avoid it," because these orb weaver webs can often be massive, like 2 meters across. They can block whole trails. There's a trade-off here, though. These web decorations make the web more visible to birds and bats. It also makes the webs more visible to potential prey insects. So they do get a lower prey capture rate, but this trade-off is definitely worth it for the spiders, because while they'll catch fewer prey, they will also save on the energy of having to produce a whole new web every single time a bird or a bat flies into it and destroys the whole thing. Let's see if I have time. I'm going to skip this video. Now let's talk about the woody layer. All the insects that you'll find, or some of them that you'll find as you go up to woody plants and the bark of trees, starting with bark beetles. So these can be serious pests of spruce and pine trees. Ips beetle loves to attack spruce and a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? Exotic pines, and then also the mountain pine beetles and native insect. These are all very small insects. You're probably not going to be able to identify them by looking for the beetle itself. You're often going to be looking for the tree being stressed or damage to the tree. And what makes a stressed tree? A couple things. Construction damage. If there's a bunch of big, heavy machinery moving around the tree, especially over its roots. If the tree was recently transplanted, if it's been underwater, that's probably the most common cause of stress. Or excessive foot traffic around the root zone, again, is going to compress and compact that soil and make it hard for the tree's roots to breathe. Probably the most common source of tree stress, not just for bark beetles, but trees in general, is a lack of watering, especially during the winter and the fall. We have a pretty comprehensive fact sheet about winter and fall watering, telling you exactly how much water to give your trees, when to water them. This wasn't a particularly, or I might be wrong about this, but it wasn't like a really dry winter. But when we have, prolonged dry winters with no snow melt, that's when you really need to stay on top of that winter watering. The plant pathology lab at CSU Spur told me that the main reason that they had so many stress trees this year was because of a lack of watering. These bark beetles, here in the top left is what the damage looks like, the galleries. But again, you probably won't see these because the galleries are often being produced higher on the tree, like towards the top. So if you see it at eye level, the tree might be already significantly damaged. And as you can see here, there's one main gallery. That's where the mom was chewing her way through. As she chewed her way through, she lays her eggs, and these side galleries are her babies. And as they get bigger, the side galleries get wider because the larvae are getting larger. Bark beetles are also the original farmers, along with leafcutter ants. They don't actually eat the wood themselves. They cultivate a fungus, and then they eat the fungus. So they're farming that fungus. And they have a special fungus storage organ on their back called a mycangia that helps them to transport the fungus from tree to tree. Also in the woody layer, you will find, I'm going to talk about a bug in a second here that's relevant to the gooseberry. But first off, I don't know if you all know this, but gooseberries were once banned in the United States because they vectored white pine blister rust, which is what you're seeing here in the top left, is the rust fungus. They're called rust fungus because the damage kind of looks like rust. Here in the middle is the white pine. It attacks the white pine specifically, and you can distinguish white pines from other types of pines because white pines, first off, pines, their needles come in packets, and white pines, needles always come in packets of 5. So you can kind of count them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then here on the top right is gooseberries. So here in the herbaceous layer, you may find this insect, the important currant worm. It attacks gooseberries and currants. And while these guys look a lot like caterpillars, these are actually the larvae of a type of wasp called a sawfly. And that is important to know because sawflies, even though the caterpillars look just like, sorry, even though the larvae look just like caterpillars, they're not. And that's important because caterpillars, like butterfly and moth larvae, can be managed with a bacteria called Bt. It's often sold under the trade name Thuricide. But because these guys, these wasp larvae are not caterpillars, this same biological insecticide does not work against them. So how do you tell caterpillars apart from sawflies? By the number of prolegs. So true legs, just for reference, are the pointy legs towards the top of an insect. All insect larvae are only going to have 6 true legs. And then the prolegs are these like fleshy protrusions towards the back of the insect. Butterfly larvae and moth larvae, caterpillars, are only going to have no more than 5 pairs of prolegs, maximum 5. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. The one on the anus counts as well. Whereas sawflies will always have more than 5 pairs of prolegs. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They didn't count the anal one again, too. So yeah, just count the number of prolegs. And one last thing, as I was researching a different presentation, I found this in a CSU fact sheet on how they described what the prolegs look like. I'm begging whoever wrote this fact sheet, please use a different descriptor word. I don't like saying nipple leg. All right, moving up to the tree canopy. We've got a few more minutes here. So you'll find a lot of hornets and paper wasps here. Hornet nests, which look like this, they're not a problem. As long as you give them about like 10 feet of clearance, they're not going to bother you. Most people don't discover them until like the fall when all the leaves have fallen away from the tree. And then they're like, oh my God, it was right there the whole time. Why was it an issue? If you don't mess with them, they don't mess with you. If it is like, over your front door or near where kids are playing, that may, warrant removal. But for the most part, they are minding their own business and they're providing a valuable pest control service. They're eating tons and tons of soft-bodied insects for us, like caterpillars, maybe like some of those sawfly larvae. Something that is particularly metal about wasp larvae is that the juveniles, the babies, when they are hungry, they signal to their sisters that they are hungry and they want meat by scraping their jaws on the sides of the cells, which you can hear. Yeah, so when the sisters do that scraping, they think, okay, my young sisters are hungry. I'm going to go and look for them now. Yeah, kind of scary. Stick insects are also found up here in the tree canopy. Here on the right is a picture of all the different types of stick insect eggs. Most of these do not occur in Colorado. We only have, I think, one native species here, the Colorado shorthorn stick insect. But it employs the same strategy of getting its eggs to survive. So stick insect eggs, they look and kind of smell like seeds. And a lot of them have this little cap on them, which you can see here. It's called the capitulum, and it's really sugary and sweet. So what happens is stick insects are awful parents. They don't invest any care into their kids. They drop the eggs often from the tree to the ground and they say, see ya. Those eggs land on the ground and they're often detected by ants. And this capitulum, it's really sugary. So the ants think that this egg is a seed. They'll pick it up, bring it into their nest, and then they will eat off that sugary cap. And then the egg is now chemically camouflaged. The ants just think it's some piece of garbage. So they'll take the egg and drag it to their garbage pile. Ants have a garbage or a graveyard often. And that'll allow the egg to gestate and then hatch in peace under the protective custody of the ants. Because, an ant nest provides quite a bit of security to insects that manage to sneak their way inside. And then as soon as that egg hatches, the baby stick insect, it hightails it out of there. It gets the heck out, climbs a tree, and then joins its parents up there. Yep, here's a picture of one of these ants carrying one of these stick insect eggs by the capitulum. Let's see. I'm going to skip this video again for time. Let's talk about Saturniid moths. So there are some really, really beautiful large moths here in Colorado that you probably have never seen before because they are so ephemeral. First off, these moths only live for like maybe 2 or 3 days as an adult because once they reach adulthood, they have no mouth because they have one job, and that is to make more moths, make babies. They do spend quite a bit of time as the larval stage. Here's what some of these larvae look like. Eating to build up the fat stores that they're going to live off of for that very short adult lifespan. Again, all the bugs that I'm showing you in these pictures all occur in Colorado. And actually, I've seen both this one and this one. This is the Glover's silk moth larva, and this is the Io moth larva or imperial moth larva. I found these both on the same hike in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs. It was like a religious experience to see both of them, not just one, but to see both in the same day. It's fascinating. And you can tell these guys don't want to be touched. They are covered on all these spikes that are meant to break off and get lodged in your skin and cause like a nasty rash. But yeah, the Saturniid moths, very rare. You don't see them, especially in cities, because we have so much light pollution, which I'll cover how to address in a second. And maybe you are all familiar with this moth, the Luna moth. I don't know if it's in the same, I think it's in the same family, the Saturniidae. These are really cool moths too, because they have these super long tails, which serve a very specific function, and that is to deal with bats. So these moths are nocturnal flyers, and bats are often trying to eat them. Bats find the moths not through sight, but through sonar by basically screaming and then trying to feel the reflected sound waves. These large tails kind of obscure or obfuscate the shape of the moth, and it makes it very hard for the bat to figure out where is the body of the moth. And it often causes them to when they go in to strike off center, they'll often grab for these little wing tips, missing the moth, allowing it to live for another day. A lot of moths also have these really weird structures called hair pencils or chromata. It only occurs in the male moths, and so they basically are reversible organs. They can come in and come out as needed. Only present in the males, by the way, and so they serve to disperse the male's pheromones far and wide, so that all the females can smell him and then come to him. It's usually the other way around. Usually the boys are coming to the girls, but in this species, the tiger moth, the roles are reversed. So, light pollution. It's a common misconception that people think that moths and other insects die because they're constantly just trying to fly towards the light. A really nuanced difference. They're actually not flying towards the light. Insects navigate by using the location of the sun and the moon, and so they're actually trying to orient themselves so that the light is always going to be on their dorsal side, on their back side. So it appears as them flying into light is just them trying to maintain that angle of the light towards their back. And that results in all these different, weird flight behaviors where they will orbit it in a circle. They'll fly up, try to keep it on their back, and then begin stalling midair, and then they'll fall to the ground. This doesn't really, it's just a nuanced thing. It's not really important to you all, as to how to manage light pollution, but I just wanted to clear up as to why they fly into lights. To make matters worse, a lot of spiders have learned that if they set up their webs right next to these lights, they'll catch even more moths. So they're making things worse. But how can we deal with this light pollution? The main way is to adjust the light wavelength. These moths seem to be less attracted to the yellow or the softer lights. You can also reduce the light intensity, or maybe, don't have your light on constantly. If it's possible, maybe turn it off during the night. If you're in like maybe a neighborhood where you need to have that light on, have it be motion activated so that only when something comes by it'll turn on. And maybe try to set the settings so that it doesn't get motion activated by insects as well, because some of these lights are sensitive to really small movements. And then also try to use maybe like a shield to prevent the light from dispersing upwards. Maybe putting one of those little like guards around the light so it's only being broadcast, towards the street or yeah. And I want to finish up today's talk talking about birds, which we can also find a lot of here up in the tree canopy. This is why it's really important to support insect diversity. Birds feed their babies, their families of chicks, often on like thousands of insects every spring. So if you want to continue enjoying the sounds of songbirds, you need to provide, their food in the form of insect diversity. A really cool adaptation that a lot of birds have is that they have markings on the inside of their mouth that indicate two things to their moms. One, that they are indeed their mother's child, and how hungry they are. So mothers can distinguish their babies, because they have a specific marking on the inside of their mouths. And also the degree at which the mouth is open will kind of show different, the markings will have a different appearance, and that'll signal to the mom, okay, this baby, the mouth is all the way open, the markings are this pattern, it must be the hungriest. I'm going to feed that baby first. Whereas the mouths that are a bit more closed, maybe not as hungry, not as high of a priority. Now, a lot of you may know about brood parasitism, also known as social parasitism. These are often birds that are laying their eggs in the nests of other birds. And they have a lot of adaptations to make sure that their babies get taken care of. One is that their chicks often hatch earlier, and those chicks will then push out the eggs, the resident eggs in that nest. They often have like a really wide body, specifically for that pushing motion. They will sometimes, push out the chicks themselves or just peck them to death. And they will often beg for food much more aggressively than the resident chicks. In this picture here to the top right, you can see that this mom, I don't know what bird this is, but this baby I think this is a cowbird. It is bigger than the adult bird, but she doesn't know that. She just thinks, her maternal instinct must tell her, my baby must be, so strong and vigorous. I need to feed it even more. They just don't understand. What is really cool about these brood parasites is that they also copy those mouth markings, which I'll cover in a second. But here are two brood parasitic birds that we have here in Colorado: the gray catbird, which I see all around Cherry Creek, and the brown-headed cowbird, which I've seen especially in Fort Collins, but they are probably all over the state. But again, these birds also copy those mouth markings. Remember, I mentioned that the birds are using the mouth markings to distinguish if that chick is indeed its own offspring. The parasitic birds are also copying those same mouth markings. So here A is a robin chick, and then B is one of those brood parasitic birds. These brood parasitic birds not only copy the mouth markings, they also copy the markings on the eggs themselves. So background, a lot of birds, they basically, when the egg is still inside them, they can kind of rotate it around inside their own, ovary essentially, and then paint it with these specific markings, like a 3D printer almost. And yeah, some of these brood parasitic birds have also learned how to copy those markings. Don't ask me how, I don't understand. And this is my last slide. Part of the reason that robins are such a prevalent bird all over the United States is because they are particularly adept at rooting out those parasitic birds. They are really good at telling apart the markings on the eggs and the markings on the mouth. And if they detect it's not one of their kids, they will kick them out themselves. The caveat to that is that some of these brood parasitic birds, they will revisit nests that they have parasitized, and if they find that their eggs have been kicked out, they will kill all the eggs in the nest, almost like trying to teach the resident mom a lesson. It's really twisted stuff. But anyways, thank you all for your time. Those are all the slides that I have, and I'm happy to take any questions now. Oops.
Thanks, Karim. And just a couple questions that are in the chat and in the Q&A, but as a reminder, if you look at the chat, we have a webinar survey that we would love for you to fill out if you can take just a couple minutes. Okay, the first question is treating spider mites in gardens and yards without harming beneficial mites.
It's a great question. So there are a lot of commercially available biocontrol agents. So there are organisms that you can buy that'll go after some of these pests for you, like spider mites. Specifically for spider mites, I would recommend buying mites in the genus Cucumerus. So there are other mites that are bigger and predatory and will go after the spider mites for you. There are other predators like minute pirate bugs, but those are more for like use in greenhouses because they do have wings, they can fly, and if you're releasing them in your yard, you don't want them to fly away.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Would you be willing, and we can actually add this when we post the webinar, when we post the recorded webinar, if you could send the links for the YouTube videos, because there are some people who would like to watch the full version and not be abbreviated.
Of course. Yeah, I have I can put like the videos that I played today, plus the ones that I skipped over. I also have a much, much longer playlist of like hundreds of hours of bug footage that I will put in that same email.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So we will post the links and Karim's videos when we post it onto the planttalk.org website. And then two questions that are kind of combined. So from an entomology perspective, what are your thoughts about timing for spring cleanup? And then also, native bees like to overwinter in some hollow stems and things like that. So if you could just touch on that from a scientific entomological perspective.
That is a really good question, one that I get really frequently. So I typically advise to wait to do your garden cleanup until the early spring because a lot of native bees and insects in general are overwintering in that plant material. Composting that prematurely, especially like in the fall, it can affect the overwintering success of those insects. There are not a ton of studies that show exactly how it affects them. Like it's maybe not going to be killing the insects, but I have seen some studies that show that when you compost material that had sweat bees in it, they will emerge too early in the spring, and then they will burn through a lot of their fat stores before spring is fully underway, and maybe they'll starve or they'll just, maybe they won't do as well as they could. So if you can, wait until spring to cut things back. If you have to cut things back earlier, just don't compost them. Leave them in an undisturbed, maybe shaded part of your garden to finish overwintering in.
Perfect. And if you wanted to move springtails to an indoor terrarium, is it possible that you could also transport some of the bacteria and fungus into that environment as well?
That one I'll have to follow up with on my in Allison's email. I'm not really sure, potentially, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe.
Okay. And I can type your email into the chat if that's okay,
Yeah,
so that they could follow up with you as well. What about controlling earwigs? So garden good guys, but can do some damage.
Yeah. To control earwigs, so one, they love dark and moist places. So if you have like a lot of like rocks or logs or any large object in contact with the soil, maybe just try to get them up off the ground, even just a few inches if they're on like a garden bench. That'll reduce the surface area, less harborages for them. They also love really large mulch particles, like the I think it's like the redwood mulch, or yeah, just bigger particles of mulch will provide more harborages. Lastly, you can create like a little, almost like a baited trap for them, a little like maybe a tuna fish can or like a cat food tin, fill it with like oil. They'll try to climb in there, I think, to drink the oil, and then they'll fall in and then drown and die and go to hell where they belong.
Maybe not in the layer where yellow jackets live.
That's true.
So referring to your slide on moss and light, is pointing the light upwards actually more beneficial than pointing it down? Do you know the orientation of light?
That's a good question. It would actually be more beneficial to point it upwards because that would mimic the natural orientation of the light. It'll be easier for these bugs to keep it on their dorsal side, on their backside. So yeah, light is pointing it up is better than pointing it down. If you point it down, they're going to try to get their back to it and they're going to fly into the ground.
And then for the native nesting bees, do you know if they're an ideal stem diameter that they would overwinter in, or how small the stem diameter could be?
I don't have any studies off the top of my head. I know that they particularly like compass plant, the larger stem diameters, but anything I would say, as long as it's like 3/8 of an inch and smaller, that'll be enough for a lot of our native bees.
Okay, perfect. And there's a couple more, but in the interest of time, squash bugs, controlling squash bugs.
Yep. So squash bugs, three things you want to do. One, be constantly monitoring your plants to find the bugs themselves and the egg masses and squish them. Get rid of crop residues from the previous year. Accumulation of dead plants will provide more hiding spots for them. And then also, squat things in that family already get tons of fungal diseases. You want to encourage good airflow. And lastly, diatomaceous earth. This is like a white crystalline powder that you would apply at the base of the plants. And when these bugs walk across it, the crystals will pierce their body and cause them to die from drying out. So it's a bit more of like a less dangerous insecticide.
Perfect. And then one more, I have to ask because this is so interesting. Samantha asked, she used pine needles last year for a mulch and she had 100 black widows. I'm thinking the pine needles may not be related to the black widows, but it just may have been a really ideal place to raise spiders.
Yeah, black widows are kind of like the earwigs. They like not moist places, but dry, dark, undisturbed areas. So maybe not the pine needles, but like if there's a lot of rotting logs near the base of the pine tree, or cinder blocks, bricks, overturned garden pots, these are all going to be spots where the black widows will want to nest. And so just get rid of those hiding spots. But I know black widows can be kind of scary because of the name, but no one has died of a bite, I think, in over 30 or 40 years. They're pretty harmless. You have to kind of be asking for it. And lastly, about black widows, I can talk about spiders in depth, but the black widow male, he totally deserves it. When he finds her web, he destroys it. He chases away other boys. He steals her food. I'm getting off topic, but get rid of those harborages is my summary.
Thank you, Karim. So that will wrap us up today, Karim. Thank you so much. This was delightful. We will post this to the planttalk.org/webinars website. And on behalf of Extension, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Karim.
My pleasure.